In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The sermon is based on these verses from 1 Peter, the first part of the reading that Bill read to us earlier. If we could have that text up. So, Christians have to be alert and switched on, Peter says. And that's strange to us because we live in such a technological age with all that's going on, that our worship and the words of our faith and prayers, they belong to a different kind of world, really. And we're seen as kind of otherworldly and not switched on. Elon Musk has a company called Neuralink, and he thinks that we will eventually become cyborgs. A cyborg is someone whose physical attributes, the physical body, is governed by an implantation, electronic implantation in the mind. It's not, a cyborg isn't someone who has a cochlear implant or a pacemaker. Not even people who cannot live for a minute, night and day without a mobile phone. Have you seen them? They bump into posts and walk in front of cars because they can't live without it. They just keep them on during the night in case they miss something. Imagine anything. So that's not really what this is. But what some people are doing is they're asking for Elon Musk's help, this company. Very rich people who have disabled children, neurodiverse as they say these days, are asking for an electronic implant for their children in order to correct these inherited characteristics. That's what's happening. That's not what he's talking about so much here. It's just that we've not to be going about with our eyes closed to what's happening all around us or to the opportunities for our faith. And then he says, did you notice? You to be fully sober. Fully sober. What does that suggest? Do you think they were half drunk, the Christians in those days? Well, maybe they liked a glass of wine. And there's nothing wrong with that according to the Bible, because it does say that wine gladdens the heart. People called Jesus a glutton and a winebibber. He provided the bevy for a wedding. And even St. Paul says to Timothy, have a glass of wine to comfort yourself if you're not feeling well. Now that would be for medicinal purposes perhaps, but you know that in our time that same argument is trotted out and is used for the justification of using cannabis for certain conditions. Sobriety has a great history in Christianity. The Methodists and the Quakers eschewed all alcohol. Church of Scotland ministers didn't. And one up in Aberdeenshire had an illicit distillery in the basement of his manse. And the clincher question, you know, when some ministers, dying out now because there's so few of us around, but it was quite common. And I know it from personal experience. In an interview with a vacancy committee, the last question would be, Minister, do you take a dram? And if the answer was yes, you were in. And if the answer was no, I will get back to you. That sense of not having any alcohol on principle was strengthened in the 19th century. The Rechabites were born in this country in 1835. It goes back to Rechab in the Old Testament, the time of King Jehu, 841 to 814. This guy called Rechab, he decided, I am going to have a sect, a group within Israel. We will not touch alcohol. And that's where that organization took its name and inspiration. Was there anybody here in the Band of Hope? Yeah. And in 1847, the Band of Hope, Jabez Tunnicliffe, a Baptist preacher in Leeds, and a lady called Jane Ann Carlyle, Presbyterian, started the Band of Hope to try and educate children and tell them you do not need to have drink, and asked them to make a pledge never to do so. And again, that was unusual. That was in the Protestant circles. The Catholic Church never had such a prohibition, and it's quite well known that Catholic priests and bishops enjoyed alcohol, enjoyed wine, spirits. Some of their church halls are even licensed. You never get a Church of Scotland licensed for. It is in the law of the Church of Scotland that alcohol is prohibited. Now, I knew a session clerk who got around that because the back door and fire escape to the hall led to the car park. So if there was a social function on, he brought his car down to the outside of the back door, opened the doors, opened his boot, and he had a lovely selection of alcoholic beverages for people to come in and out and enjoy. That's a fine example, isn't it? Well, the height of prohibition, of course, in America, 1920 to 1933. And it was inspired by Christian people, by Protestants largely, who wanted to eschew the terrible damage that they saw being done in family life and individual life by alcohol. And, of course, all it did was drive the thing underground and make huge amounts of money for the mafia. So when we look at this and we see alert and be fully sober, is it okay for Christians to drink alcohol, do you think? You could argue that a glass of wine with a meal is no problem. But we know and remember the old days of the sawdust-floored pubs in Scotland. There's not much sawdust around, but there's some pubs, they only serve alcohol. Public houses in England are more reasonable. They serve food. They're more civilized. The idea of having a public house selling alcohol for people to drink serially in it for hours on end, that cannot be right and it cannot be good. And nobody would claim that that is a Christian thing to be doing. So it's a question really of your own personal preferences and tolerances. In our church, we're kind of free, really, to make up our own minds. In other churches, as I've said, there are strict rules about that and not indulging in alcohol. But Peter's telling us you have to be fully sober. He's not saying you have to be half sober, you have to be fully sober. And it must have been that even in those days that Christians enjoyed society and fellowship, which included a glass of wine, hopefully just one. And then when we move on, he moves on to as obedient children. Obedience is not a word that's very popular. You don't hear it much these days. In fact, the only context I can think of it springs to mind easily is obedience classes for dogs. And children are not taught to be obedient. They're taught to fulfill their potential and their characteristics and their imagination and their creativity. But it says of Jesus that he was an obedient child. He found favor with God and man. He was an obedient child. He wasn't an obedient adult. He had a job to do, a vocation, a calling. And there's the old saying, you can't make an omelette without cracking the eggs. He had a nicer way of putting it in a much better illustration. You can't put a new patch onto an old piece of cloth, it'll just tear. You can't put new wine into old wineskins because they'll burst. And Christianity was the new cloth. Christianity is the new wine. And he was the new wine himself. And that break with Judaism had to take place. And so he was not at all obedient to the people in charge of the country and the nation and society and the temple and religion and faith in his time. And that time has to happen. Martin Luther was born in 1486. He died in 1543. He was an obedient monk. And he took a vow of obedience. And he broke it. And he got out of the monastery, and he married Catherine, who had been a nun, and she left her nunnery. And that was the beginning of the Protestant church as we know it. And he based that on the doctrine of justification by faith in Romans 8, and not in all of the stuff that was required of people, and the paying of the money for forgiveness of sins, and the penances, and the Hail Marys, and the pilgrimages, and everything, in what he thought had become a corrupted and fraudulent medieval church. But he had to be disobedient in order to make that break. And we wouldn't be here without people like him and Calvin, also a priest who did the same thing. Nicholas Copernicus was a medieval canon and priest. He's the guy who first suggested or showed or taught or advocated that the earth wasn't the center of the universe, that the sun was. And that was heresy, because in the Bible it says, God hath pitched a tent for the sun. It rises and it travels across and sets. And he was saying, no, the sun is there and the earth goes round and round and round. So that, of course, became orthodoxy. And he had suffered because of these particular views. But again, he had to break his vows of obedience to make that move and make that progress. And a lot of science progresses by debunking what is thought to be the case and presenting a new explanation and a new evidence to a new way of understanding. So human knowledge progresses. Now, then Peter talks about being holy. And we know that, we heard in the reading, that God said to Moses, tell the people, you have to be holy because I am holy. We know that Isaiah had a vision and it said, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. But Isaiah 57:18 also says, I am holy, but I am beside and I am with the contrite and the humble of heart. Now, holiness is very interesting. We are not in much to holiness, although it appears in some of the songs. There was a strong holiness society, a movement in 19th century revival Christianity among the Methodists in particular. Now, it was based on Matthew 5:48, be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. And these people, these Methodists, decided, what does this mean? And they kept thinking and praying about it. They realized what Peter was saying. You have to be a perfect Christian. How can you be a perfect Christian? So they evolved what they called a doctrine of second grace. A doctrine of second grace, of sanctification, of purification, at a different level from just being an ongoing Christian in daily life. And they still have that in their church. Now, the Church of Scotland never evolved a doctrine of sanctification and second grace in that way. Neither did the Anglicans or the Catholic Church. They simply held to salvation, grace and salvation in Jesus Christ through the Word and sacrament. So, the Catholics do call the Pope the Holy Father. But we don't call our moderator the Holy Moderator. Even so, there's a distinction here. Peter is actually calling the first Christians to up their game, if you like, to be more sanctified, to be more devout, to be more faithful in prayer. And not just rely on the formulas of the faith and of the church. And that's what some of them still do. They major on this progress from an ordinary Christian to being a perfect Christian, to being sanctified. We don't do that in the Church of Scotland, eh? What you get in the Church of Scotland after many years is a certificate of long service. You see the difference? See the difference? So that whole spiritual idea of sanctification and perfection. Now you might think, well, we can't be that holy or that good. But it's surprising what has happened. Because of the movement of culture in our own lifetimes, we Christians have become holy by default. We never tried, but here we are. Because the cultural tides have moved so far away from the gospel or from the Bible, from the Ten Commandments, from the New Testament. One simple test. We are the only people who don't swear all the time. But if you go to the supermarket or pass a school, all you'll hear is effing this, effing that. You know, on the television, it's effing this, everything is this. We're holy when we don't swear like that. And you've been in conversation and another person's swearing, and you're not. And that, believe it or not, is being holy. Another example is we're here. We're here, we're different, we're holy, because we've come to church on a Sunday morning. And we make that a different statement, a statement of witness. And lastly, we are holy, actually, in Jesus Christ, if and when we live for Jesus Christ and we name Jesus Christ as the living Lord of all. We are indeed holy, as asks us to be.